Welcome back. It's good to see you again. So we're almost done with the course and you've been rocking it so far. You're learning how to compose shots, utilizing your knowledge of cinematography and design. Now it's time to make those frames move. So we're going to be playing around with animating cameras like we're digital movie makers. We're going to get to grips with some basic camera moves and when to use them. Then we're going to jump into Cinema 4D where I'll show you how to get those cameras guided nice and smooth. And for the grand finale, we're going to use all of these new tricks to make a snazzy 20-second promo animation for a product. Let's do this. All right, so how about we dive into all of these different types of camera moves? I got a Cinema 4D project here with all of the different types of the most common camera moves in it. And we'll just kind of dive in and see how the world of cinematography again collides into the world of 3D in the digital space with something like camera moves. So first up, first type of camera move isn't really a move at all. It's just the stationary camera move. And basically, it's a move with no camera movement at all. And what it allows you to do is have an object or the subject, say if you have a character animation like that. If in film, it would be an actor having a really good performance. And you want that performance, whether it's an object, an animated character, or in real life, an actor, to shine. So that's where you don't have any distraction. The camera's just fixed, stationary, and you have the object or the character do its thing. So it's really great for that kind of, in that type of situation. So next up, I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna look through my camera. So remember, you click on the little viewport to be able to see through all of your different camera views. You can see I have a lot of different cameras in here. And I'm just gonna go and turn this one off from my viewport view and turn this one on. So this is a pan. I'm gonna select it and you can see that this is showing up in both of my views here. So I got my top view and my right view. How I set that up is go into panel arrangement and I just have my 3 views bottom split. And so this is just for demonstration purposes, but if you want to have this type of view, you know how to set that up. This move is called a pan, and I'm sure you've heard the term pan before, not the cooking pan, but it's a term I feel like people use and throw around for literally every type of camera move. Like, hey, that's a pan, and that's a pan, and that's a pan. And it's like, no. Those aren't, all those different camera moves are not pans. This is a pan. And so I'm gonna just hit play here, and you can see what the pan is just rotating horizontally from a fixed point. So you can rotate from left to right and or right to left. And basically what you can do, depending on if it's slow or fast, is kind of add some tension or add a little bit of fast energy. So if I'm like a whip pan, this is called a whip pan, where you just kind of whip to the subject like that, like whoopsh. And again, this is all from a fixed point. You're basically just rotating your camera along the rotation heading here, and that's all a pan is, okay? So it can be used to follow a subject's action or to reveal information. So if I had the main subject, which is that Game Boy, off screen, and then I can just kind of pan through here, you can see I'm revealing the information of this scene, which is really nice. You go from left to right, right to left. And again, that's just a simple animation of just a simple track. Now, one thing I want to point out is that on your end, if you have this set up, you might not be seeing the camera moving in all of your views at the same time. And that's a setting that I actually turned on, again, just for demonstration purposes, for just to show all this stuff off. But if you wanted to actually turn that on your own scene, what you can do is go to Preferences. Actually, let me keep hitting play here. If you go to Viewport Display, Playback in all views, if you check that off, you are only going to have that animation playback in the view that you actually have active or selected. So you can see if I click on this view, you can see that's animating. If I click on this view, that's animating, but it stops, the playback stops in all the other views. And so again, if I just turn that on, I can have all the views playing at once. And again, this is just to show what the camera movement looks like in multiple views, just for this purpose. Why this is off by default is that if you have a lot of stuff happening in all of your, or actually in just your scene in general, and you have multiple views playing that back, you can really slow down your scene. So for when I'm animating cameras or anything like that, I always have this frames per second HUD element up here, and my scene here is at 24 frames per second. So that's my frame rate of my scene. remember you also have to go, and if you hit Command or Control D, you can go into the project settings here, and you also have to set the frames per second here as well. So 2 areas you have to set the frames per second, because this is the project frames per second, and this is what the render frames per second is going to be at. So you need to make sure these both match. You're going to have some weird stuff happening. But anyways, how you can bring up that HUD, remember you want to go to your view settings, go to the heads up display tab here, or HUD, and then just turn on this frames per second. Now, this is turned on already in my viewport, but for each of these cameras, they can have their own different settings. So for example, if I have my pan camera here and I got all these different cameras, if I wanted to go to the display and turn on the grid, okay, I can independently turn on the grid on this camera, and then for the stationary, I can just, turn that off. And so if I look through the pan view, I can see the grid, and stationary view, that goes off. So when you look through the view of that camera, you're going to see all those settings applied to it, right? So if I just deselect the camera and I'm not looking through any camera view, this is where you can kind of set the global HUD settings, which is what I did. So view settings, HUD, and you can show frames per second here. And I need to make sure I'm in my viewport view here. So I was actually in my top view, and so I turned on the HUD for the top view. So I'm going to deselect that. Make sure I select my perspective view here, and you can see when I click, see it's changed to viewport right, viewport top. So I need to make sure I'm in viewport perspective, and you can see I already have frames per second turned on. You can see that toggle on and off there, but you can see those are my frames per second right there. So as long as this frames per second is above that 24 frames per second that I have for my project length, and I hit play, you can see that we're actually seeing things in real time. So if I look through my pan again, we're consistently staying above 24 frames per second. So I know that this is playing back in real time. All right, so a little bit of a side jag of some technical stuff, but let's go back into these moves here. So this is a pan, you're rotating horizontally from a fixed point. You're not moving the camera is stationary, and you're rotating and panning, right? Okay, so I'm going to turn this off. Let's look through the tilt. Select the tilt, and what is a tilt? Well, a tilt, you're going to see better from this right view. A tilt is basically your vertical pan, where you're going to tilt up or down, and basically this is also going to reveal information. You could also have like a very quick tilt up, like so, or you can have it dramatically kind of reveal information. And again, if I click on the tilt coordinates here, you can see a tilt is also happening from a fixed point. I'm not moving that camera at all, and you're just literally just tilting and animating the rotation pitch here up or down. So again, just like the pan, how it reveals information horizontally, the tilt reveals information vertically. Okay, so if you want to reveal some vertical height of an object or something in your scene, a tilt's a great way to do that. And if you go from, if you're looking down at an object and you tilt down, it's almost like you're kind of looking down at an object, making it kind of feel, small or insignificant or tiny. Okay, so pan, tilt, you have your camera in a fixed position, and you're just rotating either horizontally or vertically. Very easy stuff. Let's go to our fourth type of camera move here, which is just a push or a dolly in. So a push in or a dolly in is where your camera is actually physically moving towards your subject, okay? So you're directing the viewer's attention by going and moving your camera towards your subject and making the subject fill up more of your scene, okay? And so this is a great camera move if you want to, say, create intimacy with an object, okay, or a character, all right? So we're getting very intimate with this little Game Boy here, okay? So you can see, again, it's physically moving the camera. There's no rotation going on. We're literally just keyframing the position in the Z direction, okay? So if we go to dolly out, which is not what Dolly Parton says when she leaves a party, a dolly out is just the reverse of a dolly in. But a dolly out is the exact opposite as far as like emotion wise. So dolly in or push in, we're getting more intimate and closer to the subject. Here, we're actually removing ourselves from the subject, right? So this can kind of like make you disconnect from the subject and almost feel like you're abandoning the subject, like bye-bye, sorry, little Cinema 4D Game Boy thing. So those are the type of emotions that you can play. Just like with the emotions, you can play with the different, camera angles and camera lens choices and stuff like that. You can feel different things about the subject depending on what camera move that you're using. Okay, so dolly out again. We're just moving back in Z space, removing ourselves, distancing ourselves from the subject. Let's move to the boom or the pedestal move. And you can pedestal either up or down. So if I click and hold here, you can see that default, it's just gonna cycle through your timeline here. I got 96 frames here. So it's just gonna cycle through. But if I want to actually ping pong, I can choose ping pong. And so I can do a boom or pedestal up or down here. And so my playback will just kind of ping pong back and forth. And a boom or a pedestal is a lot like the tilt where you're revealing information vertically, but you are just physically moving the camera up and down. You're not rotating it up or down, you're moving it up or down, okay? So that is a boom or a pedestal. It's almost like your camera's on like an elevator or something like that. And it's just commonly used to, again, just like the tilt and the pan, to reveal information vertically or to, say, follow a subject that's moving up or down, okay? So let's go and look through our zoom here. And if we look at our camera, you can see a zoom. If I go to my object tab here, how you can create a zoom or zoom in or zoom out is just by keyframing the focal length here, okay? So this is zoom in, zoom out, extreme close up, zoom out, okay? So keyframing the focal length there is how you can create this zoom-like effect. And so this is not a dolly, because remember, a dolly is where your camera's physically moving in or out. A zoom is where your camera's fixed and you're just using that optical kind of zoom there, okay? So zooming in or out can do the same things as pushing in or out. Again, either getting more intimate with the subject or isolating the subject there. And of course, you can have a crash zoom, which is used for comedic effects sometimes, especially in movies like one that comes to mind is like Shaun of the Dead. Such a good movie, but there's like the crash zoom effect, like whoosh, just like that. And so this is a really cool type of effect that is very, very easy to do. Again, you just keyframe your focal length there. All right, so let's move on to the next thing, which is a dolly zoom. And no, we're not zooming with Dolly Parton here. I don't know why I keep doing the Dolly Parton jokes. But if we look through, let's actually turn this off, look at the dolly zoom. Check out what type of effect you can get if you keyframe both the focal length and move in your camera in or out while keyframing the zoom. You can either expand the space or compress the space. So you get this type of vertigo effect by dollying in and zooming out at the same time, or opposite that. This is also called a zolly. So just kind of mixing dolly and zoom together to create one word. And it also kind of creates this like tunnel vision effect too, or again, compresses or expands the space. And so if you think about it, if you think about what emotions you get when you expand the space, it's almost like you're widening your eyes. If you compress the space, you're almost feeling like it's a little claustrophobic, right? You're like you're kind of feeling a little bit nervous, or like everything's kind of caving in on you. So these are the type of effects that you can get with using this dolly zoom here. All right, so next up, our next move is a roll. So if you just kind of roll your camera along the rotation banking here, that's all that is. So camera roll, I always remind myself of like Star Fox, where you like do a barrel roll kind of thing. And basically what it does is it kind of gives an easy kind of feeling. So like imagine if you're pushing in on a scene and like the world just kind of turns upside down. So you can kind of use this camera roll, camera move to give a sense of unease, or like things are turning upside down, or things are getting really crazy. I know there was a moment in Black Panther where the bad guy takes the throne, and it's just this, it has this shot that turns from upside down and kind of rotates upright. So it's just like, the whole world got turned upside down because the Black Panther died or was thought to be dead, and this new king comes in and takes over. So it's all about, narrative and what fits your narrative. What camera move do you use to fit that narrative? So if things are crazy, a little off axis, a little bit wacky, do a barrel roll. Next up is truck. So let me just hide that other camera move. And so a truck is literally just moving your camera, animating it from left to right or right to left. And again, we're just revealing information. We could also use this to kind of track or follow along a subject. So if our object was kind of moving, and so let me actually do that. Let me turn off my static Game Boy and turn on the moving Game Boy. You can see how we're kind of trucking through this scene, following it back and forth. One thing to kind of keep in mind is, yes, it's used to reveal information or to follow a subject, but the direction you're going, whether left to right or right to left, if you think about how, at least in the Western world, we read from left to right. So movement from left to right feels more natural for us. Again, in the Western world, if you have things moving opposite from right to left, it feels a little bit odd. And so you can play that with, if you're from, the other part of the world where you read right to left, it's kind of the reverse kind of feelings. So trucking is literally just, moving your camera laterally left to right or right to left, revealing information or following an object, okay? So let's go to, I accidentally said tracking there for the trucking, but a real tracking shot is, if you notice, you're just kind of moving the camera physically left to right, so just animating along the X. A tracking shot can be a combination of moves in the position, up, down, left, right, even at the angle, like tilting or panning. And basically what a tracking shot does is it's just tracking the object. It's following the object through the scene. So it's almost like if you were watching a bird fly over your head, your eyes would be tracking that bird. So that's exactly what a tracking shot does, is it can either, angle a camera or move a camera as long as it's tracking and following the movement of the subject there. Okay, so you're just following the subject through the scene, and it's different from dollies because you can actually move, forward and horizontally at the same time. Okay, so a tracking shot can also lead the subject as well. So you can actually, if I were to go into my keyframes here and go to the tracking and have this move a little bit forward, you can see how this is kind of leading the object there a little bit, which is an interesting kind of move right there. Let me close out of the timeline. So that is a tracking shot. The thing with tracking shots, though, and what makes it so difficult is that, especially when you're just beginning to do camera moves and animate in general, it can be very easy to create herky-jerky camera moves that speed up and slow down or are very uneven and kind of feel like they have hiccups in them. So let me just give you an example of something that's kind of like a floaty camera. You can see how, it just feels like things are floating around. And so when you have this kind of floaty camera effect, number one, you have to develop a good eye to actually notice it. And number two, you really got to get into the nitty-gritty of your animation curve. So if I go in here and I look at my floaty camera here, and what I would do is I would make sure that if I go to my rotation here, and I'm going to hit H to maximize this horizontally, you can understand why this would be so kind of floaty, especially at the end here. It's because you got this like rotation down, rotation up. And so what you want to do is make sure you don't have these like weird kind of dips and valleys. You want to make sure everything's kind of smooth as possible. So for the position here, so if I select the position track here, hit H, that's automatically going to center things up. You can see why this feels so floaty is because, we're kind of going up and then kind of down and then up. So what you really want to do is just make sure everything is kind of nice and smooth as butter. And You also, for camera moves, you don't want to ease in and ease out. You want continuous movement and then cut to another camera that also has continuous movement. You don't want start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. It's very jarring to the viewer. So you want this nice continuous movement, and we'll talk a lot more about that later in this lesson. But you want to just make sure you really give some love to these keyframes. Make sure you don't have any little dips. Like if you have something that looks like this, like you're gonna, zoom in, zoom out, you got little bumps in the road. So you want to remove all the little speed bumps in your animation tracks. You can see even here, like this feels kind of odd because, actually this is, actually go position Y, can actually move this up here to follow this a little bit better, but it's nice and smooth, right? But you can see like right here, it kind of speeds up and slows down. So that's position X. So if you think about it, X is moving from left to right here. And so why it speeds up, it like slows down and then speeds up really abruptly is because of this animation track is not kind of smooth or constant or consistent. And especially if you want a nice smooth, like kind of tracking shot going horizontally, you don't want your X track, which is basically your horizontal movement, to be all over the place like this, because if I just go and play this back, see how it's like, it's like our cameraman had a little something before they went and shot this scene here. So you want to make sure everything's nice and smooth. Like literally you can get in every single position or every single animation track and really zoom in and just smooth everything out. Like I almost wish they had like an iron to iron out the wrinkles of an animation curve here. But like that's literally what I do. Sometimes I'll go in here and be like, okay, what is this? What is this little thing here? Let's make sure this is nice and ironed out. Hit H, and you can see, actually this is not really a lot of movement in this axis here, but here, like I can really smooth this out. I can smooth this out. So you basically want to just make sure, if I were to select all these Bezier handles, that it would create a nice smooth kind of line there. So nice little tip for you. Don't have floaty cameras. Don't have floaty cameras. Don't do it. All right, so next kind of camera move is something called an arc or an orbit. And let me actually turn back on our non-moving Game Boy here. So our Game Boy is just stationary there. And so an arc or an orbit is basically you just orbiting and rotating your camera along a fixed point here. And so how to do that in Cinema 4D is you would basically just kind of create a null where your target or your focal point will be, and then just place your camera as a child of that axis null there. And then to make an orbit, you just literally just keyframe the rotation heading along the scene. You can just kind of sweep through the scene, especially if you're kind of raised up, you're looking down at it, it can look kind of epic. Or if you look up at it, it can be very epic as well. If you think of the iconic Avengers shot where it's all the Avengers in the circle and the camera's orbiting all of them. So an orbit is really great for keeping the focus on the main subject and making them look pretty epic. Bad Boys, Michael Bay. I mean, there's that one shot with like Will Smith, and you're kind of orbiting around there, and it looks pretty epic, right? So there we can also do an arc or an orbit kind of vertically as well. So this is really great if you're trying to add a dizzying effect, or if you could do this very fast and you get this really cool, like it's just got so much action to it, which is really cool. So arcing movements, again, just very easy to do. I'll show you how to set these up when we plan our own camera moves from scratch. But again, it's just creating a camera, setting your view, setting that null as your camera's focus point or your axis point of rotation, and then you're just literally just animating the rotation pitch for a vertical orbit or vertical arc there, okay? And the last type of camera move is a little shake, a little camera shake. And so again, that's just, if you want something to look a little bit more indie or found footage or something like that, you can make your camera, you can add a camera shake to it, make it feel a little bit more organic and kind of like voyeuristic, where you got like a paparazzi kind of chasing the the subject or something like that. So that handheld feel can give a shot more energy and make it feel a little bit more chaotic as well. So one thing I'll show you how to set this up really quick. So basically what I do is, number one, sometimes things can get all out of whack with applying vibrate tags to an object. So what I like to do is always set keyframes for my camera. So if this ever goes off whack, I can always go back to the original position here. And so what I'm going to do to create a camera shake is just right click, go to animation tags, vibrate. And so for this, you can kind of make it look a little bit more organic by having like low frequency and high frequency types of movement. So if we want to do like low frequency, we can do a little position, and a little bit goes a long way here. And so we want low frequency, so we'll go like 0.2, do a little bit of rotation, and even rotation I really don't do much at all, like maybe 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And typically, like with camera shake, you don't have much movement, you know, going on the banking like that. And so I'll give very low values and kind of see, this is kind of like your low frequency kind of thing here. It's kind of floaty. Maybe we up this to like 0.4, 0.4. And so what's cool with this is you can then double up the vibrate tag, and you can do more high frequency. So maybe 1.5 and 1.5, and on this duplicated vibrate tag, we change the random seed that's being used to create the random movement, and now you have, you know, this broad low frequency stuff and this nice chaotic high frequency stuff. So if you combine them together, layer them up, you can get really realistic camera shake kind of stuff. Okay, so nice little tip for you there. We'll kind of up that a little bit and maybe go like 3 and 3. So this is crazy. The camera person has had way too much coffee and they're doing this shot. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of all of these camera moves that you can kind of derive and sample from the real world. And you'll notice a lot of these camera moves are very smooth, very controlled. And by doing that, by borrowing these cinematic techniques and camera moves from film, you can make your animation look way more realistic, way more smooth. And again, you don't want to have your floaty camera stuff. So if you think about it, and you plan out shots, you want to plan out not only, you know, what are you showing in the frame, make sure it's composed nice, but how are you animating the camera? Are you getting towards it? Do you want to get more intimate with the subject? All these types of things. Hopefully you can start bringing all this stuff together. And when you learn things like composition, when you learn things like cinematography and camera moves, you can bring everything together. You're that much closer to being equipped with all the tools you need to create something like a short 20-second spot for a product ad or something like that. So those are some of the most basic camera moves you can use and kind of combine together to help tell your stories and plan out all your shots. But that next step is planning out what types of shots you're going to use to make up a compelling animation. So I know what I need to do is to make a 20-second spot for this Cinema 4D Basecamp scene, but where do you even begin to try storyboarding something like that out? How do you know what shots to choose or what camera moves to use? Well, there are some handy techniques that we can use from the world of cinematography, and one of them is the concept of the 7-shot sequence. The 7-shot sequence is a go-to formula for many cinematographers, and it helps them get started mapping out a basic film, or in our case, it'll help us make a basic animation. So it can be super helpful in getting your creative juices going and is a great starting point to help you think of a well thought out visual narrative. So the 7-shot sequence goes as follows. So you're gonna have your establishing shot. And remember that this is the shot that sets the scene, establishes location, and gives context to where the scene is happening. So next, you need 2 medium or 2 wide shots. And this is basically where you can show off what's happening. It can be wide or medium, so you can bring the viewer closer into your subject or scene. And next up is using 2 close-up shots. So these shots will show any interesting details of what's happening in your scene or of the subject. So here is where you can get real close and show the object details like any cool textures. So next up is you want to have an abstract shot. So an abstract shot will allow you to add variety to an edit. It can also be used as a transitional shot from one scene to the next. Could be like a super macro shot with a lot of depth of field, or maybe the entire scene is totally out of focus for a cool abstract shot. So next up is an unexpected shot. Here is where you can get really creative and artsy fartsy and compose something that could add interest to the storyboard. So if it's like a can commercial, think of like the camera going through the can like a tunnel and like the liquid flowing around. Or maybe just show like the shadow of the object. So a frame within a frame is a type of unexpected shot that you can use for this. So once you plan out your 7-shot sequence, you can kind of repeat it for longer animations. Or if you have a short animation like we have, you can do like a 5-shot sequence. So again, if we're doing a super short animation, you can do 1 of each of the medium and close-up shots versus 2 of each. And you also want to keep in mind that this is just simply a starting point to help you come up with ideas for a storyboard or a shot sequence. And it's equivalent to the concept of 3-point lighting. So what I mean by that is just like 3-point lighting is less about the number of lights you should use, but how to use them. The 7-shot sequence is more about the type of shots you can use and not about the number of shots you should use. One other concept you can borrow from editing cinematic sequences is the 3/1 rule. And what this rule means is that typically when you think of shots, you think of them from the middle and not the beginning or the end shot to kind of help tell a full story. So for example, if you're choosing shots, you might only be thinking of starting off by showing a cool angle of the product versus an establishing shot that doesn't show the product at all, but maybe shows the environment that the product is in, and maybe the product comes into view in that establishing shot. So when thinking of storyboarding and animation, think about where your story starts and think about what happens before that and then before that. So this ensures that you won't just start your story somewhere in the middle of your animation. So for the ending, you might let things resolve and plan an animation for that. So it could be that you simply rack focus the object out of view and reveal a logo or something like that. But the main key is don't just think of the middle, think of the beginning and the end. All right, so knowing everything we know too much at this point. We're gonna build out a bunch of shots, build out a 20-second spot for this product here, which is our School of Motion Cinema 4D Basecamp Game Boy, right? And what we're going to do is just practice what we just kind of learned and plan out all the shots. So we'll have like 5 total shots. Maybe each of them will be about 2 seconds long. And they'll have the last shot will just be a nice product reveal at the end, where we just kind of have the product nice and centered. So a total of 5 shots, and we're just going to try to think about how we can do this and how you should think about creating an animation from here on out, right? So if we think back to all the shot types that we know of course, the first type of shot that you will use in any type of animation will be the establishing shot. Remember, that introduces the viewer to the scene, gives context to what's going on. So let's go ahead, let's create our first camera. Let's build out 5 shots, create a nice 20-second animation here. So one thing I should keep in mind here is I'm at 24 frames per second. So 20 seconds for me is 360 frames, okay? And we will start out at first frame here, frame 0, and let's just add a camera. So we'll go add a standard camera. Remember to look through it by clicking the little viewfinder icon and making sure that's active. And so let's just name this shot 1. And since this is an establishing shot, we're introducing the viewer to the world, I'm thinking we can like just pick a nice composition and just dolly in. Okay, so let's just name this dolly in. So this will help us like memorize all of these different types of camera moves as well, right? So let's go and let's just maybe go over here and let's just pick a nice composition. Like I'm thinking if we go into this camera, let's go to the display. And again, we want to make sure we're using our compositional rules that we've learned, right? So if we got a grid, I'm thinking we can highlight and align this coin in this little question box to this grid, so something like that. And I think what I might want to do is kind of compress the space a little bit. Let's go and change the focal length to a longer lens, like 80. And let's just kind of, you know, maybe we get something like this going on. So we got this coin at this line and that box kind of right there. And we can even see, like, does this follow golden spiral there? It kind of does, right? So again, when you start using these compositional rules all the time, you can kind of, like, your eye just kind of sees things in a composition. And so unlike where we can move and position objects around, here we're kind of composing for things that are already in place. So you got to use your eye for design, your eye design, dare I say. And so this is looking pretty good, all right? I'm liking this shot. Let's go and let's keyframe. So I want every move to be about like 60 frames, okay? And so that's about, you know, at 24 frames per second, that's about, you know, a little bit over 2 seconds per shot. And again, we can adjust as we want. But what we can do at this point is a dolly in is literally just moving in and out on the Z, right? So let's kind of move out. Again, I like my round even numbers, and I'm just going to set a keyframe at frame 0 at this Z position, making sure I'm looking through my camera. That's very important. There's some things that if you're not used to, you know, using the workflow, animating cameras, you need to make sure of some things. So again, you want to make sure that when you're setting another keyframe, you want to move ahead in the timeline to 60 frames. So if I want to type in 60 here, that'll bring me to 60 frames. And so now you'll see that keyframe dot is now just outlined red. So that means there's a keyframe on this track, but there's no keyframe currently here. And we'll just dolly in here a little bit, something like that. 244, perfect round number. And we got this ease in, ease out. So you can see that the ease in, ease out, again, will be jarring. If you're easing in and easing out of each shot, it's very jarring. You want some nice continuous movement. So every time I create a camera move, I'm going to go into my timeline here and just select these keyframes right here. Just change them to linear keyframes there. And let's just move this down. And we can hit play, and we got this nice linear. Let me make sure I actually did that. I think I might have hit undo accidentally. We got this nice continuous zoom in, or not zoom in, but dolly in. Remember, zoom is a different thing. Misusing the terms already. See, I do it myself. So we got this nice move. One other thing that I like to do as well, just to give flexibility while you're editing things, is remember you can select a track in the timeline here. And as long as you got that track selected, you can go to the track position properties here. And before, you can have this kind of continue instead of just stopping. So it's just going to maintain at that position there. But if you go and say, okay, after continue, you can see that that line's going to go up. And I can do that before, have that continue. So I just have this constant speed here. So now, if I wanted to, I could speed this up by moving this forward, or making this a little bit steeper. So you can kind of have a lot of flexibility here just by moving a keyframe. Also, another thing I like to do is if I know I'm going to have a new shot every 60 frames, what I could do is create markers. Okay, so I can know where, because you can see at 24 frames per second, I'm only getting like 24, 48, 72. The 60 is not really turning up unless I really zoom in. So what I like to do is create markers. So if you go click and hold on this marker drop down, I can go and say create markers. And what you can do is I can name this just shot 1 and hit OK. And you can click on that and you can see that I can move this to frame 0. So that's the time that this marker's at. And what's the length? Well, it'll be 60 frames. And if you type in 60, you can see we have this nice marker here that we can go and name, change the color and name, of course. And what I'm going to do is let's just make a nice little rainbow kind of color effect here. And so now you can see that even with my timeline closed here, I can see that shot 1 is between these two areas here. So by frame 60, we're getting a little too close. So I think maybe what I'll do, go into the timeline, and at this point I can just kind of, move this up or down. Now, one thing you want to not do is accidentally just move the marker. You want to make sure you're selecting this little area here and moving the timeline. Otherwise, you'll move just the marker. So it's a little confusing because they're the same color highlighted. But if you go and just move this out, you can see that we have this nice continuous movement. So I can, just move that track in or out and get whatever I want. Okay. So now we're at frame 60. What do we want to have our second shot be? So we have our establishing shot. Let's maybe do a medium shot that's kind of trucking and revealing a little bit of the Game Boy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to command click and drag to duplicate that camera and look through it. Let's name this shot 2. Let's make this a truck shot, not rook, not a rook. Do that. And we'll just go ahead, if I hold the Command or Control and Shift key down and click, that'll remove all the animation keyframes of that camera on the position Z. So there's no more keyframes on it. Let me get out of the timeline view here. So I'm looking through this second camera. You can see the wireframe of that camera there as well. And let me actually just go into the display. Let's turn off the spiral grid. And what we can do is let's actually maybe, because if we talk about layering, having that depth, what we can do is maybe get in on here and maybe we can truck from left to right and kind of reveal some of this. Maybe use this little block here as a little revealing element here. So if we kind of align this to that bottom third there, see how like even the details of the Game Boy here kind of align as well. So if we just kind of truck. Now the one thing I want to introduce you to is the concept of tangents. You don't want to create tangents. And so what a tangent is basically if I have this, the exact bottom of this object flush with the edge of the frame, it just looks weird. So you either want to like give some room or kind of crop it off so you don't have that tangent. So another tangent could be if we compose this shot where this end of this object match this end of this object as well, creates a tangent, looks really odd. So you just want either some space or some overlap, okay? So, another tangent could be, is what I go on through my tutorials all the time. I go on tangents, like I'm on a tangent right now. No, but if I have this Game Boy kind of perfectly flush to the ground, that's creating a tangent right there, okay? So just a little PSA on tangents and why you want to avoid them. Just looks weird. So if we're kind of zoomed in here, so I got the second shot, the focal length is 80. I will have this set up where we're zoomed in a little bit more. That ground plane, like the horizon line, will be matched up with the bottom third, and this area will be 2. And then we got this nice kind of vertical element right here as well. We got this Tetris piece kind of aligning and leading your eye to the gamepad there, the directional pad. So we got a lot of stuff working for us compositionally here, and that's the sweet spot, right? And so now you're just kind of animating that composition, putting that composition in motion. And so again, a really nice smooth camera move can literally just be a truck from here to here, okay? And because we have all these foreground and middle ground elements, we can sense the depth because we got this little star, we got this Tetris piece in the foreground. We can see that kind of parallax happening, which is really nice. So it's important to combine all your compositional elements together, layer things in your scene, all that kind of stuff. And so let's maybe start right here. Zoom in a little bit more. So this is like a little bit of a medium shot. And we'll set a keyframe right here in the X. And we'll go 60 frames, so we'll go to 120. So I'll just type in 120, then trying to drag to get to where we need to go. And we'll just move, say, right here. And what I'll do is kind of align this where this corner of the rule of thirds is kind of matching up to the buttons, okay? And so I'll set another keyframe. So you always need to remember that you move your playhead, because sometimes what I'll do is I will not move the playhead, and then I'll move the camera and then set another keyframe, and I'll just overwrite that first keyframe because I forgot to move my playhead down and set that second keyframe. So a little gotcha there. I'm sure you'll do it a few times before you get the hang of it. I do it all the time still to this day. So if we hit play from this point, you see we still have that ease in, ease out. So let's go to our timeline. Let's select this position track here. You can see the ease in, ease out. Let's hit linear. And so now we got shot 1 and then shot 2. And let's actually command click and drag to to duplicate that marker. Let's name this shot 2. And this starts at frame 60. Let's do 60. And the length is 60 frames. Okay, so this goes from frame 60 all the way to 120. And so visually we can see that. And let's go down the rainbow here, change that to yellow, and we got this going on. Now, big problem here, and while I'm thinking about it, let's just go and do continue and continue. So we got that continuous keyframe. If we wanted to speed this up or slow this down, we could do that very easily just by moving this keyframe. So we can slow this down, right? So we got this nice smooth movement, but we're always looking through that truck shot. How do we create and kind of cut between different cameras in Cinema 4D? This is very easy to do. What you need to do is basically create an object that's called a stage object. So stage object is right in this menu here. And so one thing you can do is you can see that I accidentally went into this menu. If you have trouble finding anything, Shift plus C brings up the commander. Just search for stage, and it's going to search for it, and it will just pop up with what you're looking for. Double click, and there is your stage object. So what a stage object allows you to do is keyframe which camera is active and which camera you're looking through in your scene. So if I want to animate between looking through shot 1 camera and shot 2 camera, all I have to do is, number 1, drag and drop this shot 1 camera into the stage object area here. And then at let's go frame 59, I'll set a keyframe, okay? And so what I'm gonna do is change which camera is in this little slot here. So if I go to frame 60, I can drag and drop in that truck shot, set a keyframe, and so you'll see the stage object here. If I zoom in, you can see here is that shot 1 keyframe. So there's the camera that we're using for that keyframe. And then for this keyframe, we're looking through truck shot 2. So if I go and I play this out, see, we're looking through camera 1, then we're looking through shot 2. And so we can kind of build in these nice little cuts in our animation using what's going on here. And while I'm thinking about it, let's save early, save often while you're doing all this stuff, okay? And another thing to worry about too is, we got these 2 shots, but what does this look like rendered, okay? Because we can still use depth of field. Remember, that's a compositional rule. Let's start to figure out those types of things as well. So let's go to our Redshift IPR. Let's start that up. And while that's going, what I'm going to do is navigate over to the optical tab, because remember, that's where you can kind of get your aperture, turn on your bokeh or bokeh. It's bokeh, okay? So we'll turn that on. And so what's the focus distance? Well, it's this arbitrary 2000 that is set by default. And you can see that's way the heck out here. So one thing that's nice is if I want to say, maybe I want to start my focus at the question box and then rack focus, which is basically just keyframing the focus distance from that object to this object. I can do that, okay? And so why I would probably do that is because I would like my focus on this, because what we can do is a little bit of eye trace. And eye trace is a very important thing in animation, especially when you're kind of cutting between shots. And so one thing that I just realized is that we have this coin right here, and when we cut to the other shot right here, we have this block that's nice front and center. So what I mean with, let me just turn off the IPR here. What I mean by eye trace is that we can have our eye focused here, and then we go to the next shot, we're still looking in this little area, and that's some really good eye trace, because then we can actually just naturally go from this spot and look over to the right and see like, oh, okay, there's some more information in the scene. What you don't want to do is have something down here and then go to another shot where something's happening up here, because when you have that big of a gap between where the action or where the focus you want the viewer to look at is so far apart, the viewer can get lost in the shot and not know where it should be looking, where their eye should be looking. So it's always important to use eye trace. And so if I have a big element here and the action's happening here, when I go to the next shot, there should be action or something from the viewer to look at here. And then you can guide them to something else. So if I go, and again, let's adjust the depth of field here. So if I turn on the IPR, I look through the shot one camera, got my aperture. And so one thing that's really nice is, remember, my focus is like way off in the distance. It's like way out here. If I want to first focus on this block, all I need to do is click on that little eyedropper and just tap on the object that I want to look at. And you'll see that now there's my camera focus right on that block. And so I can open up the aperture a little bit and make a little bit more depth of field. And so maybe let's do like 4. That looks good. And so what I can do at this point is I can keyframe the focus from this distance, and then maybe a little bit later on in the shot, I can then go get the eyedropper tool again and click on the coin, set a keyframe. And so now we have this nice rack focus that goes from, if I just go in here, you can see the actual focus changing and animating. See that little box there, that little guide, rack focusing from this area to this area, okay? And so if we go full frame here, you can see that we're zooming or dollying in and then rack focusing to this coin, right? And that's looking pretty nice. That's probably a little too heavy-handed on the old blur there. So maybe a little something like this. One thing to also realize as well is when you're composing your shots, you might need to light for specific shots. So I would say that this coin is a little too dark for my liking. And what I did was I just kind of lit for that main hero shot of the Game Boy. And so what you might find you need to do is if you again, because I lit for the camera view to be right here, but my camera is way over here now, what you might find you have to do is just, create another light and light for that shot. So what I can do is let's create a light real quick, area light, and then let's just make sure this is really blasting the scene here. And so I just want to basically light that coin. Light that coin. And so I'll just make this a small light. Now we got it. See, the coin's right there. And so I'll just make this smaller, and I can name this coin light. So when I see it, I can know exactly what's going on. So I can even bring down the spread, bring down the barn doors there, and then just pull back the exposure. Maybe even shrink this a little bit more. So I just want to light it just a little bit so it's not so dark. So that's looking pretty nice. The exposure a little bit. And so before kind of gets lost, after, boom, that is way more of a focus element now that we kind of lit for this composition. So keep that kind of stuff in mind when you're doing that. When you're composing, you might need to relight. You probably will need to relight, okay? So now we go from this shot, we go over to this shot, and you can see that things are pretty nicely lit. I actually like this is a little bit darker, this little blocks in the foreground. Again, I lit for the Game Boy to be really nice. And so we're just kind of dollying over. And let's see where our focus is. So for some shots, you don't even really need depth of field if you really don't want it. But if we wanted to, I could say, let's have the focus be the Game Boy. And let's turn on the bokeh. And we just got a little bit of blur there. Okay, so maybe you bring this up to 12. So just a little bit of blur, just to give a little bit of depth. Okay, and we're pretty close to making a tangent here. So remember, Let me go get out of the IPR. If I was like this, that's creating that tangent where we got that edge of the object right at the edge of the frame. So I gave myself just a little bit of space there. And what's nice about the fact that I'm only keyframing this, the X position, is I can freely adjust this, the Y position or the Z, and have the animation intact because, you know, I'm not changing anything that's animated, right? All right, so let's go to shot 3. What should shot 3 be? We got our establishing shot, we got a medium shot, we got our eye trace going on, which is really nice. Maybe we eye trace from this shot. Maybe we kind of focus in on those A/B buttons there, okay? And maybe we have it where we have like a little arcing motion, or like a little arcing down, and we can do something like that, okay? So let's duplicate this truck shot. Let's name this arc down, and this will be a close-up shot. So shot 3, and let's make sure to look through it. Again, I can't look through it because the stage object's active. So this is a very good thing to kind of troubleshoot. It's like, why can't I go through this camera view? Well, because the stage object dictates what camera you're looking out of. So what I'm going to do is actually just turn off the stage object, and then I can look through this shot, and I can keyframe to this shot, this camera view later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's compose our shot here. So first off, I want to Command or Control Shift click to remove that animation track there, and let's just compose my shot. And let's make sure we're at frame 120, which is where this shot will kind of go. And so we'll kind of arc down like so. And so let's actually throw out, I bet we could make a nice golden spiral here. And so if we have the edge of the Game Boy here kind of act as this bottom arc, and we got the rule of thirds grid, maybe that that button is right there, and so we got a little something like this. I think I'm liking that. And so how do we create this arcing motion? Because if we were going to go like this, we're not really orbiting. Let me actually show you why this is kind of why you don't want to just go boop. Number one, if you take a look at the coordinates here, when I move this, we're actually moving the position and the rotation. So we're keyframing a lot of things to be able to get this movement. So more animation track means more likelihood that you're going to have the little, herky-jerky movements because you have all those animation tracks to wrangle with. But if we went in here and said, okay, well, number one, let's bring up the camera focus distance to right about there, and let's create a null. So this will be the arc down shot 3 focus null. Actually, I guess this will be the pivot point too. And so at this point, what we can do is we just move this null right into where we want it to be. So we want the arc to be kind of right centered into here, okay? And so let's make sure it's kind of flush. The wall there. Yep. And let me just Command or Control Shift Z to undo that camera move. Again, you could do that up here and do undo view, but I just, it's really good to memorize Control Shift or Command Shift Z to undo or redo moves. You can also get out of this camera view here and just freely move around and position this correctly. So we're gonna orbit down this way. Let me just undo that. So this is looking good. Let me go into my camera view again and just make sure this is composed right. Liking that. And then we can go into this null, and you want to basically center this up. So what is also helpful is if we go to the display, turn on the crosshair, boom, and then we got that axis center right there. Okay? And so what we can do at this point is just go and make this camera a child of this null. So at this point, all I got to do is hit the R key and rotate this up or down along the X. And you can see we got our nice arcing movement. And see in this view right here. So instead of having positional, like 3 positional keyframes and 2 rotation keyframes to create an orbit, I can just use one animation track, okay? And so that animation track is this rotation pitch. So this is kind of like an example of a 2-node camera where you got a fixed focus and like a null element, and then you kind of control and move the camera independently. So you just don't have one camera having all the animation inside of it. So if we go and let's make this an even 3 degrees. Again, we want to move down to 60 frames later. So if I was bad at math, I can say 120 plus 60, and then that's going to do the math for me. Okay. And then we will kind of arc down like so and hit another keyframe. And so we got this kind of movement. Again, we'll go to our timeline and we will make sure to zero out, or not zero out, but make those keyframes linear, the rotation keyframes here. Let's roll that down. And another thing we can do is do the continue and continue. So if I wanted to speed this up or slow this down, again, we could do that very easily just by moving keyframes. And then I'll command click drag, and we'll create another marker here. This will be shot 3. Redo the color to green. Got a nice rainbow of markers here. And so now all we have to do is keyframe the stage object here. So we'll turn it on. And so at frame 119, or actually at frame 20, we'll go from truck shot 2 to arc down shot 3, okay, and set a keyframe. And so we'll go boop. And so see how that kind of, we got a continuation, we got some nice continuous eye trace here. So where the buttons were in the previous shot is not far off where the buttons are in this next shot. So that is another great example of eye trace. So now we're orbiting down. And so let's actually fire up our render. Let me actually save this first. Fire up our render. See what this looks like as far as blur level goes. And so if I wanted to, again, I'm probably not animating the focus here. So if we go to optical, let's just choose our focus distance to be the A button there. And so that will update. And then we could probably bring down the depth of field there so we get a little bit shallower depth of field, maybe 4. Let's see what this looks like. I'd go even shallower, 2. So we're getting some like, it's almost like micro kind of shot looking good. 2.8. And so we got this looking really nice. And I'd say that's looking good. And if we get out of our IPR, you can see, are we maintaining a good composition across the entire shot there? I think so. You know, everything's aligned to the grid, all that kind of stuff. And so we talk about eye trace. It's a great way to have a kind of continuity of edit. It's a nice smooth edit. Another important thing is continuation of motion or movement, or having the same camera moves from one shot to the next so it matches. It's also going to be called like a match cut kind of thing. What we can do at this point is, let's turn off let me move this down there. Let me turn off the stage so I can freely move throughout different views. And let's command click and drag our setup here, because I think what I want to do is create 2 arcing down shots to get that continuation of movement, to have a nice smooth edit between these 2 shots. And let me just make sure I just delete the keyframes there. And so I'm at frame 180. Let's go and let's move this shot up. And so I think, again, so we're arcing down. This will be another arc down. And I think for this, I want to get to, here's a big gotcha. So I was trying to go into this shot and move that camera. What I forgot to do was not look to look through it. So I'm still looking through my other camera, which I didn't want to move. So that's where Control or Command Shift Z, I'm going to undo all that. And then I think I went a little too far. So let me just make sure this looks good. Yep, that looks back to normal. And so what I need to remember to do, so let's name this shot 4, and then I need to make sure that I'm looking through that duplicated camera and then start moving, because I'll do that all the time. Like I just did it now. You want to make sure you're looking through the right camera before you start to move stuff around, okay? And so at this point, let's go, and we're in our right camera. For this, let's actually do a diagonal. And so let's try to match the logo with this diagonal here. Okay, so maybe something like this. And I'm thinking what could be really cool for this abstract shot is to have like you were very close up. We can have shallow depth of field, and we can kind of have a rack focus from this C all the way down. So this could be very shallow depth of field. And I think that should work really nicely, because we're kind of varying we have a nice variety of shots. We have our, if I turn on let's just go and just keyframe this right away. So let's go to the stage. Let's drag in. So at frame 180, we're switching to camera 4, shot 4. And so just want to like recap what we got so far. We got our establishing shot, dollying in. We got our trucking shot. That is a medium shot. And then we got our close-up. I'd say this is a close-up shot that is orbiting or arcing down. And then we'll have our abstract shot also arcing down. Okay, so we have a variety of shots, which is really nice. Keep interest in the edit. And so for here, let's make sure we have the focus null. Let me actually just get that shot, that camera out from underneath the null. And so I can freely move this null around like so. And again, I could just click on that, or actually turn off the stage, then get out of that camera view so I can freely move around and make sure that null is nice and perfect. And I'm also going to zero out the rotation that we had from before. And so I'm also going to, let's see, look through this shot. Let's make sure this is nice and centered there. So we'll orbit around about the A, and then we'll make this a child, the camera, a child of that null. So I can move this around, and let's see what this would look like if we orbit down. And so that's looking pretty good. Just orbiting this so this diagonal looks good. And so I think this is looking pretty nice. So maybe we can start right here. So I'm at frame 180 and got a keyframe there. Let's go to, so 180 plus 60, we'll go to 240 and kind of go down and set another keyframe. And so we can even like rotate this if we want to get a nice, whatever angle we want. Also go into the actual camera here. I'm just trying to match that diagonal pretty good. So let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I'm liking that. So let's go down to the rotation. We'll remove the ease in, ease out. Let's turn back on the stage. At frame 180, we should be in shot 4. Yep, we are. And so, boop. So see, there's continuation of motion. And that kind of, even though we're kind of zoomed into a completely part of our scene, the continuation of movement, the same camera move, kind of makes it a much smoother edit because we're going arcing down and arcing down. Okay. So now we got to do is figure out the depth of field. We want that really nice shallow depth of field, rack focus. So let's go in, and basically what I want to do is go to optical. Let's go to our full view here, start that IPR up, and let's just choose our focus. This needs to be right there. So on the C, all right? And so this is pretty shallow depth of field. I can go even shallower, like 1.8 or even 1. 1.2. So very shallow. And so I'll keyframe that focus distance, and I'm just gonna move this down because this shot starts at frame 180. And I'll go all the way to 240. And so I can say, all right, the focus will now be on the 4D. So I'll go to the dropper, click right there. And that's so cool. Like, that's so awesome that I can just like click on there and change the focus very easily without having to go into my 4-up view or anything like that. And so I'll set a focus distance change there. And I'm fine with actually having the ease in, ease out for the rack focus here. So you can see this is nice, smooth ease. You can see that rack focus doing its thing, looking really nice. That's really nice. And then I'll get out of the IPR there. And so we got this nice movement here. And let's just command click and drag to get our marker. And this will be shot 4. And so we got one more shot to go. Be our big finale. Not shot 34. Oh my goodness. 34 shots. That'd be rough. We got this. And then a shot at frame 240. We'll have our last shot. So I'll command click and drag. We'll just do this while I'm already here. So 240. And I'll bring this all the way to 360. So 20. So this is there. And then name this shot 5. And get a little purple. And there we go. We got all of our markers there. Let's go. And I'm actually going to borrow, I'm going to command click and drag this camera here. Name the shot 5. And this will be, we'll dolly out. Okay. So we're dolly out. And let's actually do a cool roll. Barrel roll. So we'll make this roll. And we'll look through it. Again, we got to turn off the stage. Then we can look through it and we can start composing our shot. You can see all these different cameras in our view here. So what we can do is we can just hide these from view, or we can go and we can just totally hide all the cameras. But the bad part about this is it'll remove your helpers there. You can go into the filters and uncheck camera, and none of your cameras will show up in your view. So if you want to do that real quick, go for it. But I still want to have that, all those compositional helpers there. So I'm going to just kind of hide these by just clicking and making the top dot red. That means it'll be hidden from a viewport view. Okay. And so dolly out, roll. Let's make sure we move the focus distance keyframe and then this keyframe again, Command or Control Shift and clicking to remove all that. And so let's actually remove the golden spiral. And let's zoom in here. So we'll have a little bit of continuation of the shot from before. So if I go to, let me actually at frame 240, we'll actually switch to this shot 5. So set a keyframe, and now I can turn back on the stage object and we can actually see what I'm talking about. So that's the last shot of shot 4. Boom. Kind of just pushing out. And so it's a little bit of continuation of the shot, kind of like a match cut. When a match cut's basically you're just matching an element from one shot to the next. So it could be a shape that's consistent, but a different part of an object. So a circle in the center of the scene, you go to a different shot, it's another circle, but some other different thing. So we got this. I think I'm liking it right here. So what I'm going to do is, since we're just dollying out, I think we're just going to need to move in the Z and maybe a little bit in the Y. So I'll set keyframes for both position Y and position Z. Let's go to the very end, and then we'll just back out. You see as we just back out there, we're going to need to adjust a little bit to just frame up and get that back of that corner of that wall lined up with the bottom third line there. And so just kind of zoom out like that. Maybe get that little question box in some nice strategic places. And I think that's looking pretty good. So we'll set some more keyframes there. So this is what we got. Let's hit spacebar to play. And you can see very boring, ease in, ease out. So let's go and tweak some keyframes here. Another thing I want to show you that you can do is, just like in After Effects, if you just want to play back a certain part of your timeline, we can do that as well. If I just click and drag right here, I'll just frame it up right there. You can see we're basically just trimming our playback area to just this area here. And so now you can see we will just, when it gets to the end here, we'll loop it back to the beginning of this little area right there. So very helpful to be able to kind of dial things in like so. And so what we can do at this point, let's go and let's get nitty gritty with some keyframes. So let's twirl up some stuff here. And again, if we just want to focus on just the camera, I can click and drag that right in there. So I can just isolate these tracks like so. And so we have this ease in. I really want the Z position, which is basically our main dolly out movement, to be really, really fast. And so what that means is we will need to really flatten this out. And another thing, another tip is never have your camera movement just completely come to a stop. Especially at the end of a resolve where you have a logo resolve or something, always have some kind of subtle movement happening, because the moment that movement stops, it's where all the action dies and the viewer gets bored, right? So let's really flatten this out, but we'll still have a little bit of an angle here. So we have some movement going on, right? And so let's also look at the Y position here, hit H to maximize our view here. And so I'll just flatten this out. And again, you give a little, not have this be flat, so we have a little bit of motion all the way to the end. Let's see what this looks like. So a lot more energy. Need to make sure we flatten this out, just like the Z axis here, or the Z position there. So if I bring up both, you want to make sure that the steepness is about the same, because if not, you're going to have, again, that little bit of hovering. So let me do this one more time. So if I had this kind of like this, and we hit play, see how like zooms out, and then we have this weird kind of hovering down. So you want to match the kind of curves so everything stays centered there, okay? So that looks nice and smooth, looking good, okay? So we got some buttery smooth moves. We need that roll, right? So that'll just be in our banking here. Remember, this is like you can create your Dutch angle, all that kind of stuff by just tilting with the banking there. And so let's go, I think what direction we should go. Let's try it from this direction. And we'll set a keyframe and go all the way down to, actually, let's have the roll kind of end earlier than everything else. So just bring this to 0. And so now we got our rotation banking here. And so again, we'll flatten that out. And we want this to come to a nice smooth stop. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, I'm liking that. I think I want to even go more extreme, so I can select that keyframe and hold shift and move this up, or I can just change the key value there. So let's see what this looks like. Hit play by hitting the space bar. Let's really flatten this out though. A lot of energy there. We come to a rest. Really nice. Now, remember I was saying how you can, move cameras, always have continuous animation with the camera move. Something else that helps, and you can notice that I have my random effectors that are adding a random movement to the secondary elements that are floating around. That creates really nice interest. You can also slightly animate or really animate the actual like subject of your scene, which is this Game Boy. So for example, I think the shot chain, let me actually just move the playhead out so we get more of the composition here. So you can either move it here or down here, this little power slider. And basically you see that we have that match cut, but it's a little weird going from here to here where it's just tilted. So I think what we can actually do is, just like we have this really cool roll that adds a nice rotation, what if we had our Game Boy kind of spin and reveal itself as well? So you can feel free to animate your actual objects to help have a really nice composition as well. So let me just go to the end frame, and I'll probably just animate the rotations. So I'll just keyframe all the rotations there. Let's go back and let's really rotate this. So it's like kind of like a nice reveal. And you can see that keyframe all that. And so you can see now we have this kind of boring rotation. So we just need to, again, just really make these curves steep. So right now I am just looking at the F curve of the camera that I dragged in there. So what I can do is I can go back to bookmarks. I can go to default bookmarks to get back to everything else, or I can go and just drag in the Game Boy and I have all the rotation keyframes in here. And so let's select them all, hit H to frame them all up. In the major movement, I think the only movement is happening in the rotation banking here. So I actually don't even need the rotation, unless I want to, add a little bit of subtle rotation to the other rotation values. I'm not sure yet. I'll think about it. But all I need to do is select the rotation H, hit H, or rotation B, hit H, and again, just really flatten out this. So it's a really quick spin, like so. So this is pretty. So even flatter than that. Come on, let's go. And the thing is that, so the last shot, we're looking at this flat on, right, for the shot 4. So actually what I need to do is command, click, and drag, get that original keyframe in there. So we're actually looking at it not rotated, and I'll just go here, get a linear keyframe there. So you see what I'm talking about? Like, we need to have this rotated the way it was, and then do like a hold keyframe. And actually this is a frame off. So at frame 240. So right here, I just need to move these keyframes down. So we're at frame 240. We switch cameras and we have that rotation, the Game Boy rotated. And there we go. We got something like that. And we can even move this in. And again, we can even do the continue on the end of it. So we have some subtle rotation happening the entire time. So that's looking pretty nice. So that movement is kind of creating a nice little transition as well from shot to shot. It's like a little wipe. Still want to get really super steep though. Yeah, that's looking nice. And I think I do want to have some subtle rotation happening at frame 240, like maybe have this move there, that. So just have a little bit of movement on the rotation P and the rotation H. We just make sure these keyframes align. Yep. And so yeah, just a nice little movement there. And let's make sure these don't ease. So I'll just make these the little soft keyframes by clicking this little button here. So they'll just kind of like almost make a straight line. So no easing. So it's looking pretty good. And let's see here. There we go. That's looking pretty good. And let's see what we got all together. So let me go back to default bookmarks and let me bring my power slider all the way to the back. So again, we can see everything. And let's play this from the top. Let's go all the way to frame 0. And again, this is nice to see like where each shot kind of happens. So let's hit play. So we got boom, boom. So we got the orbit down, another orbit down. And actually, I'm not quite sure what moved here, but this is not centered anymore. So I need to make sure, move this over, just recompose that shot. Okay, that's looking better. And then there we are. I think because I changed the rotation there, that's why it was all off. So subtle rotation. Again, I had that like hold keyframe that I did not do. Let me bring this up. That I did not do for these other rotations. So if I just do that, that should be good. And so let's actually go back. And so, yeah, now I just got to change this back. So always diagnose what just happened. Like, what did I do that made this change so oddly, right? So we can even zoom in a little bit more. Let's see. Yeah, looking nice. And there we go. The one thing we did not do is we did not check our last shot here to see what that depth of field was. Yeah, depth of field's all whacked out. So when you are dialing everything in, you get the camera moves down, right? And then you start to see like, okay, well, how does this look like when this is rendered? That's important. And one of the nice things is that I know this last shot needs to maintain focus on the Game Boy this entire time. So remember, we can go on the optical tab and we can choose an object for it to be the focal, to be the focal distance. So I can just drag and drop the Game Boy in there, and this should be the focus object. So let me actually show this from the top view so you can see what just happened there. So if I click on this and clear that out, I'll just move this wherever. You can see that the focus is all off. If I drag and drop that Game Boy in there, boom, it's going to snap to wherever the axis center of that object is. Okay, so it's going to snap right there. And I think as far as like the depth of field, like the aperture, the amount of depth of field, that looks pretty good. Another cool thing as well is that, let me actually go to this shot. Another cool thing as well is, you know, I basically animated the focus distance here, but when you actually have this set to an object, you have this offset here, so you can actually offset this to like, you know, actually the axis center is like right dead center in the thickness of the Game Boy object. Like if I look here, you can see there, let me go to right here. The axis center is like in the middle of the thickness of this Game Boy. So if you really needed to get like a really shallow depth of field, like let's do 1. Actually, let's do 0.1, which is totally not realistic, but you can see how shallow that is. This looks kind of cool. And you can use this offset, so you can actually have that object focus, but then you can offset that from where it is. So we can go back or forward just by adjusting this offset like so. So a cool little handy thing. You can keyframe that as well. But the nice thing is that if I just bring this back to say 4, 3, that this, when the camera moves, it's going to hold that focus on that object the entire time. Okay, so that's really handy to drag and drop an object in there to have that focus. And I would say this is looking really good. Now, the last thing to do when you have a lot of objects moving and you want to go and render, one thing you can do is you can bake in motion blur, okay? And this would be good to kind of show, because motion blur is different. It's not the same as depth of field blur where you can actually see the blur effect in your frame. If you want to see motion blur, you actually have to go into your Redshift render view here. Let's just dock this like so. Fire that up. And so your motion blur settings are in this Redshift area here, motion blur. By default, it's off. But if you want it to look very film, if you want your animation to look more realistic, you need at least a little bit of subtle motion blur, okay? So what I'm going to do is do enabled. Transformation steps is like how many samples is it going to apply to your motion blur to calculate the motion blur. If you don't have enough steps, an arcing kind of movement might just look like a straight line. So it's almost like you don't have enough lines on a arc to have it actually have a smooth arc. So it's kind of like the interpolation on a spline. So all that being said is typically you can get away with 3, and that's enough of those calculations to have a arcing object have a nice smooth arcing motion blur. Especially if objects are moving super, super fast, you might need to up this. Deformation blurs, if you have an animated bend deformer, and you have movement caused by deformation, you want to turn this on. But in this scene, I have no movement coming from deformation, so I can turn that off. And then, of course, the shutter. If you know about how shutters work in real cameras, it works exactly the same here. The smaller this number, the longer the shutters open and the more blur you'll have. So typically this is like a fraction of a second. So if this was like 15, again, you're not, let me actually go to right here where there's a lot of movement. And you can see there's no motion blur here. To actually see what the motion blur looks like, you actually need to fire off a render. And so you can do that by clicking this button here. And what that's going to do is just kind of render this shot. Okay. And so you see what's going on right down there. And now you can start to see what that motion blur looks like in your actual shot. Okay. So it's just a little bit of a gotcha. I know you can see the depth of field blur very easily in the progressive mode, but if you want to see the motion blur, you have to hit that little clapper button to go from the progressive interactive render to whatever it's going to look like on your final render. And so you can see the strength there. If we bring this to, say, 120, that'll mean the shutter's open for a much smaller time, which means you'll have less motion blur. So the bigger this number, the less motion blur. So let's fire that up. And the smaller this number, the more motion blur, because your shutter's open longer, there's going to be more streaking going on. Okay, and so now at 120, you can barely see, you can see a little bit of fuzziness here. So even a little bit of motion blur goes a long way, okay? So let's just, let's try to split the difference and do like 90. And just another PSA in that, let's fire this off again. Depth of field blur, motion blur, any type of blur will add to your render time. So it's important to keep that in mind. There are ways to render out your animation with an image sequencer or something like that, and be able to apply the motion blur in post, like in After Effects, and we'll cover that soon. But just to say that if you have a slow computer, you're probably not going to want to bake all these things in. If you do have a pretty beefy computer, you can bake in your motion blur. But the thing is that you don't have the flexibility of changing it in post. So there are smart ways to kind of work, and we'll like I said, we'll cover that. So there's your depth of we got your depth of field blur, your motion blur again. You only be able to see your motion blur by firing off a render by clicking that button right there. Otherwise, the only thing you can see in your progressive render, because remember, what we're seeing right now is your progressive render, and your final rendering will use that bucket render, which is this render right there. And so you can see depth of field blur, you can't see motion blur using this mode, okay? So nice little gotcha there. But then when you're ready to go, just go all frames, render it out. You got your motion blur set up, and you want to make sure that you kind of go through each of these shots, make sure all the depth of field looks good. And because that, again, that's one thing you're not going to be able to see in your viewport. Well, at least accurately. Let me actually show you really quickly. If you want to see motion or depth of field blur in your viewport, you can go up to options and go to depth of field, and you can see a nice subtle representation of this. So you don't have to fire up a render every time, but I like to do just that, just because this is it's close, but it's not completely accurate. So you can see if you really bring this down, the depth of field is not as near as strong as it will be if we went to fire off an actual render here. So let's do that. See, look how much blurrier that is than what we just saw in the viewport. So it's helpful to have a nice little guide of where the focus is, but all that's to say is don't just trust that all on its own. Like, get it for a nice, like, okay, there's a little bit of blur there. How about here in this shot? Like, okay, there's a little bit of blur there, but you're not getting the full picture just by having this turned on. But it's a guide. It's a nice, loose little guide there. All right, so I'm sure at this point of the course, I don't need to tell you again about how important it is as a 3D artist to study films and cinematography, because lighting, composition, camera moves, they're all things that will make or break your render. And personally, when I learned 3D, I didn't pay attention to any of that stuff. I just wanted to make some cool liquid simulations or something like that. But I've had to learn all of these foundational concepts on my own over the span of my career, and I still have so much more to learn. So the fact that you're in this course and you're already exposed to all of these concepts and know how important they are, that's huge. You're learning all of the 3D superpowers and how to use them right at the start of your 3D career. And like a smart person once said, with great power comes great responsibility to make really awesome renders. All right, I'll see you in the next video.